Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
Thanks for being here. My name is Emma. Welcome. Hello. Starting here with pre-writing and first drafts, we're actually getting into the real act of sitting down and putting pen to paper, which can be tough. One of the most common things that we hear throughout the Writing Center and people coming in, students coming in for help, is not being sure how to get started. It can be really, really difficult. You know, when you've done all of your reading, you've done some research, you have a ton of ideas, and it's really hard to formulate them into a cohesive paper. And I'm here to talk today for the session a little bit about how to get going on that. So one thing that you might be familiar with is something that we in the Writing Center call the 40-20-40 rule. Okay, so the 40-20-40 rule looks at the proportion of time that you're spending on various aspects of writing. So the first is that we spend 40% of our time on pre-writing. And pre-writing includes all of the research and reading that we've talked about so far. It also includes what our focus is on today of creating an outline and formulating our ideas into a cohesive structure. 20% of the time is actually writing. That's like fingers on keyboard, pen to paper, putting words down. And that's not a whole lot of time if we're looking at only 20% out of the whole proportion of time that we're spending on a writing assignment. Because that last 40% we want to spend on revision. So the more time that we spend formulating our ideas, structuring our ideas, the less time we actually have to spend writing everything out, and then we have more time to revise. And we'll be working on a revision workshop, actually 2 sections of a revision workshop tomorrow, so we'll get to that. So once you have done your research and readings, you're ready to formalize your ideas. So the benefits of creating an outline is that we can clarify the paper's final organization before it's done, right? Before we even get started, we can figure out where it's going. Overall, we reduce the time spent on writing so that we can meet that 40-20-40 ratio that is advised. It also allows us to provide an approach to revisit the topic and thesis. So if we're just writing on a blank page, just like starting from scratch, trying to fill it in with our words, then knowing where our thesis is, knowing where particular parts are, can be really hard to go back. If we have a structure and we have a clarified approach, then it's a bit easier to revisit particular ideas. It also means that we can address the topic comprehensively. Again, just starting from a blank piece of paper or a blank screen, sometimes we're just getting our ideas out there, but the more that we structure our ideas, the more we can create connections, and we'll have a more in-depth approach, and we're less likely to miss important things that we might otherwise miss. For the first exercise in this session, start an outline. You don't actually have to write anything in it, but just look at the best way that works for you to create an outline. You can start with a blank Google document, so you don't have to use that format. You could just use a blank sheet and write your own structure, your own outline skeleton if you'd like. You could write notes on the outline provided in the PDF editor if you want to use sticky notes, or you could start an outline on a blank piece of paper if pen to paper is best for you, and any other option that works best for you. So once you have decided on your approach and how you're going to start your outline, we're ready to pick a topic. Often course instructors will suggest topics many times, or they'll give you 5 and you can kind of pick from them, but almost always they'll suggest a topic and it's up to you to choose the nuance within that topic, and we'll talk about how to do that. Also though, usually instructors will give an option for you to come up with a topic of your own choosing. It often needs to be approved, so if it's not one of the ones that they've recommended, you can come up with your own. You just need to get an email approval from them to write about it so that they know that you're going in the right direction and that you're writing about topics that relate to the course enough for them to evaluate you. So in the task of picking a topic, there are a few different ways to go through it. The first would be to look for problems or issues in the field and decide on your position. A second approach could be to focus on one specific part of the issue. Looking at an issue that's too big can cause decision paralysis. It also makes researching really hard. Now, if you're at the point where you're obviously with your research, you likely already have a topic in mind if you have some research documents already, but sometimes it's necessary, even after you've done all that reading, to figure out how you're going to narrow it down. It's also okay to be confrontational. You can choose a topic that lacks widespread support. It's easier to defend a topic when you take a strong position. Keep in mind, if a topic lacks widespread support, think about why that is. You want to use research and sources to support your argument. So if your argument doesn't have a lot of support, there might be a reason for that. It's also, of course, important to remember to be respectful. Maybe if you have a position that lacks widespread support, that's okay, as long as we're being respectful of alternatives, right? We want to make sure that we're not being bigoted, for instance. So start from what you know. What in your experience has contributed to your knowledge or opinion on that topic? What do you think before even thinking about the course content or what you've learned in class? What are your ideas of a particular topic? And you can kind of help that guide you from there. And lastly, if you're really stuck, try out simple binary choices to see if one matches your position on a topic. So whether it's good or bad, if you agree or disagree, if it's right or wrong. And then once you pick that particular choice, then search for nuance within that area, within that stance. So for the purposes of this session, you can write about whatever it is that you'd like, but I will talk about some examples that relate to that lecture, just so you know. Okay, so since we're working on this now, choose a topic. So we can consider these questions in relation to a lecture, maybe that we've seen, or we can think about maybe even a lecture that you saw during Jumpstart. But consider the questions of what the main ideas were that were presented. If there's anything interesting, any particular current issue that has caught your attention recently that you might be interested in writing about. Within that issue, is there anything that you agree with or disagree with? Anything that you can expand upon? And was there anything that opened up new perspectives for you? Anything that you could see yourself researching a little bit more? And once you've thought about these things, I'll give you a couple minutes. Write down a topic that you'd like to explore in your essay outline. For those of you who are interested in exploring Dr. Freeman's lecture or readings a little bit more, a topic could be looking at colonialism, at historical views and perspectives. Some of the themes that came up from Dr. Freeman's writings and lecture were about racism in society, about colonialism, about globalization. She also talked a lot looking about historical perspectives, and as Brian sort of chatted about in his sessions yesterday morning, I'm forgetting what the term is right now, but looking at historical perspectives from our current view. And that could be a theme that we want to touch on how we view history from our current standpoint. But I mean, really, I would go with any particular issue or particular question that feels important to you. Another idea could be from that writing task that's posted on Brightspace. There are about 11 questions there that I know a number of you have looked at already. And you could start from that, and you could pick a different one if you've already written a bit, or you can take the one that you selected and wrote about for your writing task and expand on that a little bit more. So there you're given a question where you have a stance. You're asked to agree or disagree, how much or how not, and that can be a topic that you can start with if you'd like. So we're going to move on from there. So once we have our topic, we want to get a bit more narrow and we want to create a thesis statement. So thesis statements are often quite difficult. A lot of students have a hard time getting it, like narrowing down a good thesis statement, and that's okay. It's meant to be hard, and I'm just going to say this right off the bat, but I'll say it throughout the presentation. Thesis statements change. So we create one and we think of one right off the bat, but as we research and as we write, our ideas change. That quote that Brian talked about yesterday morning, he mentioned how we sit and we write to work through ideas and issues, and we often land somewhere unexpectedly, and that's totally true. We're in somewhere unexpected, I should say. And so that's totally fine. We always talk about thesis statements as a working thesis statement. It's rarely ever finalized until we're done revising our final draft. So a thesis statement is, number one, an argument that is narrow, specific, explained, and reasonable. And I'm going to go through each of these. So an argument, first we have a statement right here. This paper will discuss the starting time for schools. Do you think that that statement is an argument? This paper will discuss the starting time for schools. Stop there. All of you said no, which is great. You're all good. So it's not an argument, right? This is a statement. The fact that the paper discusses this topic, I'm not going to argue with that. That's what the paper does. What we want to do is phrase the stance of the paper as an actual position. So an alternative here would be schools should start at a later time of day. There we go. It's like that's a beginning of a thesis statement right there, because I have an opinion, I have a particular issue or idea, and I'm taking a stance on it. So now that we have an argument, we want it to be narrow. So schools should start at a later time of day. This is pretty vague. What are we talking about? What schools? Who going to schools? Like, is it any school? Is this adult classes? Is this swimming classes? What does later time of day mean? How late? What are we talking about here? And now when we're narrowing our thesis statement in practice, oftentimes your research will help you narrow that down. So if your research only speaks to schools in India, say, then you're going to talk about schools in India. Alternatively, before we even get into writing, we also might want to narrow our scope right off the bat and only look for papers that refer to schools in India. So that narrowing process happens both ways. It depends on the research that we find, and it depends on the research that we search for. So an example of making this narrower, we could say school instruction should start at a later time of day for students under 12 years old. So here I've narrowed it down a little bit more to the particular age of students, and I've narrowed down schools a little bit more to school instruction. Now our next criteria is, criterion, I should say, is to be specific. And so now at that later time of day, that's the one that's still pretty vague, right? So we still have our research is narrowed, but we want to specify what our actual argument is, what we're actually talking about. And so here, school instruction should start no earlier than 10 a.m. for students under 12 years old. Now we're getting a little bit clearer, right? Now it's becoming quite apparent what stance I'm taking to what degree. And the last step, this isn't always necessary in a thesis statement, but it is good, is to explain why this is the case. So we're going to get at that a little bit more in our introductions. I have a bit to talk about introductory paragraphs, and it's good to give an explanation of why do we care? Why does this matter? Why is this my stance? And so here I've provided a little bit of explanation. To improve student academic success and well-being, school instruction should start no earlier than 10 a.m. for students under 12 years old. You know, again, this is right off the bat, this is what I have, but this is a great thesis to start from and move forward on. It also, of course, needs to be reasonable. A good thesis statement, and I know Lauren's talked a bunch about this over the last couple of days, not to have generalizations. Schools start too early. What schools? What are you talking about? What does too early mean? Personal beliefs, starting schools before 10 a.m. damages students. If you don't have any evidence to support something, or if you're speaking more from a subjective point of view, then you want to avoid that and switch to a more objective lens. And of course, absolutes. So any school that starts before 10 a.m. And there we have that language, any school. And of course, we never want to speak in absolutes about each other or about work. We don't want to do that within the field or within literature either. Now that we have a topic, we've talked a little bit about a thesis statement. Think of possible answers to your research question. Think of something that could be disagreed with or agreed with as a stance. Try and look at whether you can localize your argument in time or space. Are there limits that you could put on the investigation? What does your research or evidence speak to? And can you give the reader a good reason to care about your point? Can you explain why your point is what it is? So again, take a couple minutes right now just to come up with a thesis statement. Remember that we're all just practicing this right now. It does not have to be perfect. It certainly isn't going to be perfect right off the bat. But this is just to get you thinking about the process of creating a thesis statement. Does it have to be one sentence? It doesn't have to be, but for starting out an essay, it's better to try and get your argument into one sentence. Yeah, the more succinct that you can make your argument, the more it will help you in writing a clear and cohesive paper about it. I mean, the whole point of an introductory paragraph, which we'll get to, is to provide some of the context and background on the issues. And so your thesis doesn't need to include that kind of explanation or description. It just needs to speak directly to the issue that you're writing of. The other thing as far as about it being just a single sentence is that especially in first year, especially in your first couple classes in university, when you're writing essays, professors will really be looking for where your thesis statement is within your introductory paragraph. They want to see that you know how to formulate an argument and how to say it succinctly. And so the clearer and shorter your thesis statement is, they want to be able to underline it and say, okay, this is what my student is arguing. And so, you know, aside from what is used in literature in a professional sense, for the sake of your courses, definitely the more direct and succinct you can be, the better. So once we have a thesis, we want to think about how our argument will proceed throughout our essay. So we create what we call a mapping scheme. A mapping scheme tells the reader what you plan to say, provides a list of supporting arguments, and it helps the reader and writer organize your ideas into sections. A mapping scheme can be thought of in a sort of formulaic form where X is true, X being your argument, X being your thesis, because of A, B, and C. So now A, B, and C here, this is your reasoning, basically. If you remember from Brian's session yesterday, he talked about evidence versus reasoning. This is your reasoning. So here I have that thesis I was working on before. To improve student academic success and well-being, school instruction should start no earlier than 10 a.m. for students under 12 years old. This would stabilize students' sleep patterns, mentally prepare students for daily learning, and promote healthy childhood development. So there are 3 things that I'm using to support this argument. As a reader, if I'm reading an essay that has an introduction that finishes with these sentences, I expect that the essay is going to cover these topics directly in this order. So once I'm finished the introductory paragraph, I think that the next thing I'm going to read about is how this change in school time would stabilize sleep patterns. Then I expect to read about how it will mentally prepare students for daily learning. And then I expect to read about how it will promote healthy childhood development. So I expect each of those to be covered in that order. And keep in mind the approaches to outlines that we're giving here. This is a very, this is obviously English, it's North American English, and it's generally the approach that we use in North American academia. There are all different kinds of writing styles, and that's true in different areas and different countries, depending on where you work and what you do. But this is what's expected in academia in general. So keep in mind, if you're writing essays for a different purpose, we always want to keep our audience in mind. Okay, so here, exercise 4, support your thesis statement. So it doesn't need to be, I gave 3 examples there, and 3 is kind of like a nice magic number that people like, but you can have more, you can have fewer, depending on how well they support your argument. But create a list of points or sub-arguments that could be used to support your thesis statement. But I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to jot down some ideas of how you might support that thesis that you're working on. Once you have an idea of how you're going to support your evidence, it's a good idea to organize the points into the order that you're going to talk about them to write out that mapping scheme. So this can be done through independent reasons. They might just be completely separate ideas. There might be a historical timeline, and so if something happens in a certain order, say you're writing about history, then of course you want to go with where we started and then what happened and the sequence of events that kind of just falls into place. And that's kind of like Kirley Freeman's paper, where she talks about Charlie Soame's life, and she talks about it in the order that it happened. You could also look at the most to least important point, or the least to most important, whatever feels the best and strongest for your paper. And of course, much like a timeline, there might be a logical sequence where your first point lends itself to the second point, or the second one, the argument for it depends on your argument for the first one, and so it kind of has to go in that logical order. We're getting really we're kind of fleshing out that outline, right? So we have that mapping scheme, and now that mapping scheme blends itself to each of our body paragraphs. Each element should be addressed within a body paragraph, or if it's a longer essays, a whole section, a whole chapter potentially. We use subheadings sometimes to outline what topic it is that we're talking about at the time. And so when you look at that outline, you can see the topic sentence for each of your body paragraphs. The topic sentence should be related to an item in your mapping scheme. Paragraphs help readers by using single focused claims and clear transitions to clearly explain each claim to support your argument. They're a unit of an argument, and they do not simply address one idea. And we'll talk a little bit about how they don't just address one idea because of all of the things that are contained within them. So the elements of a body paragraph, which you can see in that outline, first we have a topic sentence. We present our evidence and our explanation as that reasoning. And lastly, we have an integration and conclusion. So a topic sentence clearly and directly states the aim that the paragraph will demonstrate. It also transitions from the previous paragraph or the previous piece of evidence so that the reader isn't just kind of like abruptly, oh, now we're talking about something different. We want a bit of a transition between our paragraphs. Our evidence is, I know we've talked about this a bunch in the last couple of days, it can be scholarly research. We can present them in quotations or paraphrases, and how we do that and how we cite our sources, that will be covered tomorrow morning with Adrian's citation stations session. That's at 10 a.m. tomorrow. There might be statistics, there might be lab or survey results, or there could be primary evidence being something that you did. So your essay might be about an experience. You might be writing an essay on a co-op placement or some task that you had to do for a class. And so your primary evidence is the interviews, the experiences that you did. So that's all research. That's all evidence and sources that support your point. And what your sources will be depends on what is expected of you for your paper. For every piece of evidence, you need to demonstrate your understanding of the material. So you can't just present a quote or paraphrase or just present information and assume that the reader knows how that information relates to your idea. You need to be able to take that evidence and say, this evidence shows this, and relate it back to the topic of that paragraph and relate it back to your thesis overall. So you want to reinforce your point by summarizing your argument and relating it to the thesis, or if you have a really long paper, to whatever part of the essay you're talking about in that section. So once we have that sort of thing flushed out, we have an idea of what evidence will be used to speak to each of your items in your mapping scheme, then we can jot out and complete that draft. Once you have an outline, you're really kind of ready to flush it out. So common elements, this approach can be used for almost any paper. Either way, we always have an introduction, a body, and conclusion. There's clear organization, there's a linear progression, and repetition of forms, in that overall, we have an intro, body, and conclusion within our paragraph as well, right? We have our topic sentence, we have our evidence and our integration, and we have a conclusion to bring it back to our thesis statement. And this is true for any style of writing, although in the session right after this, you'll be looking into your discipline-specific styles of writing and seeing how this format has some nuance and variance within particular fields of study. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on introductions and conclusions, just to kind of help, because a lot of students do struggle with aspects of their paper here. Once they have an outline done and you've got all those little sections in that outline filled out, how do you actually write an introduction? An effective introduction will usually include the following elements. Note that I have usually, because not all of them need to be there. It depends on your paper. And I also just want to note that they do not have to be in the order that they're being presented in. So I'm going to go through some examples of not so good and good opening sentences. Here's an example of an opening sentence, and I'm going on that thesis that I was working on before. Around the world, children attend school in the morning. How do you feel about that opening sentence? Do you think it's good or bad? And why or why not? As a reader, if I read that first sentence, like, what does that mean? Around the world, children attend school in the morning. First of all, not necessarily. Some kids don't go to school. Sometimes it's not in the morning. Some children are with their parents. Sometimes children are homeschooled. And aside from it being general, it also doesn't really tell me anything. Who cares? Yeah, children go to school. Great. Right? It doesn't introduce anything to me. So here I have an alternative that might sound a little bit better. The 9-to-5 workday has been established for decades in North America, and the same expectation has been placed on school children. Now I know what the essay is about, right? Right off the bat, I say, okay, we're looking at how school children are expected to be working, are expected to be on throughout the day. Great. What it does is introduce the topic. Next up, mornings signify a new beginning. How do we feel about this one? Too vague? What does this mean, right? Personal opinion? Yeah, absolutely. Maybe mornings signify dread. Maybe it's rolling out of bed, or like mornings don't signify anything. They just are. It's just a time of day. This is pretty meaningless. An alternative, and I have this here because this sort of mornings signify a new beginning. Like maybe people want to include phrases or slang or colloquialisms. And so I have this included here. So while we often agree that the early bird gets the worm, we forget that the early bird may be suffering from sleep deprivation. Now, again, I have an idea of the topic, right? We're talking about the possible consequences of early mornings. I'm integrating a common phrase. Early bird gets the worm is a bit of a slang term that people use sometimes. And while it is a little bit casual, depending on your audience, that might be okay, but it's also kind of a hook, right? It's a little bit funny. Sometimes the opening sentence, it's good if it piques the interest because it's a little bit like, that's an idea. Yeah, so that's also a potential idea. So idioms are slang words. It's not that idioms are slang words, I guess. I'm using slang incorrectly. It's more just that if I was writing a formal essay, I don't know if I would use this as my opening introduction. So it's not slang, but it's just that it uses an idea that is not literal. It doesn't mean that it's bad. A lot of times this would be okay. Just depends on your audience. Okay, and lastly, opening sentence example. What time is appropriate for children to start school? Now, I'm just going to go ahead with this one. We recommend in the Writing Center generally avoiding questions in your paper anywhere. Anytime that you write a question, instead of writing a question, write the answer. Right off the bat, as a reader, I don't want to work. That's just kind of what is expected for the culture of reading and writing in academia here in North America, that the work should be done for me. I don't want to have to think what time is appropriate because you're the one who's telling me. This is your argument, so I don't want to be asked any rhetorical questions. So instead, we have the answer. Enforcing early mornings on children can have numerous negative impacts on their well-being. The opening sentence could also be a quote related to the topic, totally. And that does happen really often. If that is the case, I would be sure that you select a quote that serves really well as a topic sentence, that it introduces the topic and that it's clear where the essay is going from that quote. So I would be careful of not overusing that, but that's also totally an option. Okay, so we have our opening sentence. We also provide context. And context answers those W questions. We have what? What is the main issue? What text or theory are you addressing? So you might be writing about a literature review, for instance, and then we, of course, want to make sure that we're talking about the book, that we reference it. Who, where, and when. So if you're speaking about specific people or characters, where, we talked about localizing regionally, and the time period you're speaking to. Is it all the time? Is it not? That one example, I forget who it was in the chat, who mentioned that universal basic income is important in the age of automation. That's a great addition of context right there, where we're talking about our current time period, and you can get a bit more specific about what age of automation actually means as far as our time period there. And why, the explanation of importance. Now, we've addressed some of these within our thesis already, so you might not need to have a whole separate sentence, right? We don't want to get too repetitive, but we do want to make sure that the context that does apply to your argument is covered so the reader knows where we're starting from. Of course, we include our thesis statement and we include our mapping scheme. And that generally is what makes up our introduction. A conclusion usually includes a signal, so I might say in conclusion, not always, but it's a good way to get started on your writing. A summary, and that summary is a restatement of thesis and a reiteration of the mapping scheme. Now, we don't want to use the exact same words, but what we're doing is we're bringing the reader back to a close, right? We're saying, okay, we've gone through all of this, and now here we are. Let me remind you of how I supported my argument and what my argument is. Let's get ready to sort of round the bases and get back home. Often we include something about moving forward as well. So we might have recommendations, forward trends, future research that could be done to further investigate the argument that you're looking at, or the potential impact of your argument, the potential impact of what it is that you're saying. And lastly, a final statement, your sort of mic drop moment. Everyone's familiar with that phrase, so that it feels like it's the end. And again, these don't need to each make up their own sentence or section. They can be integrated together. Okay, conclusions do not just simply rephrase the introduction, so it's not just like a complete reiteration, but they also don't introduce new ideas or facts. We can talk about moving forward, but we're not creating new arguments. As per usual, we don't make absolute claims, and we don't want to draw unreasonable conclusions. We want to make sure in the conclusions, too, that we stick to the research and the scope that we're speaking about in the rest of our essay. Okay, so that thus ends the pre-writing. I have this exercise 5, but this is not necessarily to be done right now, but it's to fill out that outline, however it is that you're approaching your outline, and then from that, flush out your paper into complete sentences and paragraphs. So once you have that outline, that really lends itself to transition into a final paper and to get that first draft done. Remember that writing is a recursive process. The goal of an outline is to set you up for success in writing your first draft, but we always want to go back and revisit things. That's it, everybody. Thanks for joining, everybody. I hope that you got some help out of the pre-writing exercise and that it helps you get started on your either this particular practice or for your future writing assignments.